Hello, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our panel discussion on holding media accountable to Blackness and the radical needs of now. I'm Kristen Schilt. I'm the faculty director for the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and I want to thank our co-sponsor, the Reproduction of Race and Racial Ideologies Workshop, for co-sponsoring this event. Before I turn it over to the panelists, I just want to flag two upcoming events that we have. On October 21st, we're doing an event called The Virtual Turn, Doing Ethnography During and Beyond a Pandemic. And October 29th, we'll be featuring a book salon with Kareem Kubichardu on his book Ishtail, Accenting Gay Indian Nightlife. So I hope you can join us. You can find information on our website. So I'm going to turn over the discussion to Amber Butts. Amber is the managing editor of the Black Youth Project and will be one of our panelists and the moderator for today's discussion.
Thanks, Kristen. Thank y'all for joining us to holding the media accountable to Blackness and the radical needs of now, especially in this time. This conversation is really important, and I'm very excited to talk with Jen and Hari about all of the things that we'll be discussing today, as well as like uplifting the work that they have been doing. I'll just go ahead and give a brief bio of our speakers, and then we'll just hop right into it. So Jen Jackson, they, them, is a queer, androgynous Black woman, lover of all Black people, organizer and assistant professor at Syracuse University in the Department of Political Science. Hari Ziad is a cultural critic, a screenwriter, the editor-in-chief of Race Baiter, and the author of Black Boy Out of Time. Check that book out if you don't already have it. They're a 2021 Lambda Literary Fellow, and their writing's been featured in BuzzFeed, Out, The Guardian, Paste Magazine, the Academic Journal of Critical Ethnic Studies, among a bunch of other publications. And then before we get into the questions, I just want to highlight a couple of the platforms that we've all kind of participated in and also are a part of. I'm the managing editor at the Black Youth Project. The Black Youth Project is a platform that highlights the voices and ideas of Black millennials. So through knowledge, voice, and action, we work to empower and uplift the lived experiences of young Black folks today. Hari and Jen were also previous Black Youth Project managing editors, and so it's really exciting to just like have y'all here. This just feels a lot like family. Shout out to Dr. Kathy Cohen, who, you know, work has inspired all of us and also has inspired a lot of other things, including Gen Forward, Race Baiter, PYP 100, and a lot of other stuff. Next up, I want to just talk a little bit about the other platforms and services that we're kind of in conversation with too. So the the Gen Forward Survey Project is something that Dr. Kathy Cohen, along with other researchers, including Jen, have been working on for years. It's a nationally representative bi-monthly survey of 18 to 13-year-olds that also amplifies the voices of young adults with oversamples of African-American, Asian-American, and Latinx young adults. And you can go on the site at the Gen Forward survey to find out more information. There's a lot of data there, and some of the context for Gen Forward is that Gen Forward's focus is to kind of liberate some of the data that we've been compiling and putting it to other folks in the community so that it doesn't just remain siloed in academia, which is really important. Also, please let me know if I'm speaking too fast. Thank y'all. Lastly, Race Baiter is a platform created by Hari to explore the various ways race is expressed and defined with the goal of creating a world without all of its intersecting oppressions. The space is dedicated to imagining and working toward a world outside of the white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchal capitalist gaze, with a particular attention to the function of anti-Blackness. And I got all of that out. I was trying to figure out if I would. It happened, y'all. It happened. All right, welcome everybody. If you want to share anything before we hop into the questions, please do. I'm going to mute myself for about a minute. Okie doke. So let's hop into it. And while we're on these Zoom calls, please remember to stretch and drink water.
Yes.
Okay, so while we might begin to see Black organizers on mainstream magazine covers and certain folks might shout progress, what's not often highlighted is the work Black communities have always done to pass on information with little to no recognition. Whether that be to warn folks or to educate through rumor, gossip, superstition, word of mouth, it's necessary that we revisit these core practices as we continue to live in a fascist state. And we know Black folks are no stranger to building systems of accountability and alternatives to a state that is constantly trying to kill us. In this conversation, we'll talk about what is possible when we center these visions, when we take data, storytelling, and resource sharing into our own hands. We'll also talk about social capital and calling ourselves to attention when we are complicit in supporting the machine that requires us to be backdrops for larger stories. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us. I'm excited for y'all to answer these questions.
I'm excited.
I am too. I'm also like very like intimidated, right? Because I feel like in this moment, we've become so dependent upon media, but at the same time, there's such a fraught relationship with our communities and the ways that media is produced and how it often co-opts our stories and our narratives and our histories without giving proper credit. So I'm excited, but I feel like this is a big conversation for 1 hour. So yeah, I want to see how much we can get covered. So do you want to start, Harry, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you. I thought we were going to start with the question, but
I thought so. Amber, how you want us to flow? Do you want us to?
I'll just ask a question and then y'all share whichever one of you feels most called to share, both of you.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question I have is, what responsibility might writers have in presenting stories that invite fuller representations of Black life? You're both writers. What do you think?
I want to give this to Harry first. Go ahead, Harry.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you, Jen. I agree. I'm a little intimidated by this conversation too, but also because we're part of these systems that we're critiquing in this conversation, and what parts of it are applicable to us, and being accountable, which I'm sure we'll get into later, is really important. But yeah, I think I'm so glad you mentioned like gossip and rumor in the introduction to this, because there's so many other ways of telling stories and being a writer. I mean, I think when I first read that question, I was thinking more traditionally, but I think we all have some sort of like writer, all artists at least, this question is applicable to us. And I think we have full responsibility towards that. Representing Blackness in fullness, because only through, I believe, showing what a world where Black people can be liberated, which I think is representing Blackness in its fullness, can we start to live that world. And as artists, that's our job to do that. And I think our main responsibility in doing that is to make sure we're not reproducing the violences of white media. A lot of times we're forced into these structures in order to get paid and in order to continue our work. And so it can be really easy to get sucked into the way things have been done. And so I think it's really important to, at every step, to like reevaluate where you are and how you're pushing back, and not getting sucked into those systems.
Absolutely. So I completely agree. And I think as Harry was talking, I was thinking about over the years, how we've seen like the kind of increased focus on media from movements, like artifacts that come from movements. We see folks who are photographers who are in movement work, who are recording what's happening in Ferguson and Baltimore and Oakland as it's happening, and who are part of these communities. And I think a lot about Black folks, and I talked about this before, but like Black folks being the preeminent storytellers, right? And how oftentimes, because Black narratives and Black stories are seen as so, from dominant society, are seen as so obscure, and so I hate to say foreign, but foreign, right? And because they are seen as so distant, sometimes there is an internalization that happens within our own communities where we feel as though we are not entitled to tell our own stories, right? And so when I read this question, the first thing I thought was, the first thing is we have to understand that we have the right to tell our own stories, and that we absolutely should be telling our own stories, right? And that may not always come with justification and validation from these larger, more established media outlets. It may not come with the big grants. It may not come with the fanfare and the ceremony, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not worth telling. It's not worth doing, right? It doesn't mean that it's not something that should still be done. And I think that's, it sounds nice to say on this side, right? After having been doing this for a long time and starting to be able to see people say, okay, well, I'm glad that you're telling this story. But when I started out, that was very hard. That was very, very hard. And I think that especially for young, Black, queer, trans, undocumented, disabled folks, that has become even harder because of the propensity to co-opt and exploit those narratives. So I think there is responsibility absolutely on writers, right? But I also think there's a lot of truth telling that we have to do, both with ourselves and within the industries and the disciplines and the academic circles and the networks we find ourselves in, right? We have to often be truth tellers, not only on the page, but within the communities that we find ourselves situated, especially when they sit in contention with Black liberatory politics.
That was fantastic. Thank y'all. Yeah, that makes me think a lot about just writing accountability, and what your writing is informed by, and kind of what you can do and what not to do, right? Like we know, Nola from Queen Sugar is like a perfect example of like not checking in with your family and community to ensure that the message and the representation that you're providing for this larger, usually white audience, is in line with who you are. So what is your writing informed by, and to which communities are you accountable to in your writing specifically?
I love this question. I love this question so much. I was like, but how do you answer it? Because I feel like I'm accountable to Black people, right? Like I'm accountable to Black people. But I'm like, but there's just so much to say in that answer, right? Like, I am, and I think about what folks see when they see me, right? Like I am a Black, queer, grew up poor, working class woman, right? I am androgynous, I am gender fluid, and there are certain ways, I'm polyamorous, right? There's ways that I move through the world very deliberately and intentionally in my identity. And I, in my opinion, am accountable 100% to folks in those communities, right? Like that, I check in with folks before stuff gets published. Like I'm like, hey, I was about to cuss. I'm not supposed to be cussing out here. Just to make sure I'm not on that mess, you know what I'm saying? Like just to be like, hey, like, are you reading this the same way I'm feeling that I'm writing it, right? Like how is this coming across? Because I think that a lot of times there's this like unwillingness to be challenged sometimes. And accountability for some people feels like confrontation, or it feels like cancellation or whatever. And I'm like, I love accountability. Like I love being held accountable. I'm like, hold me accountable, because then I know that you love me and you believe I can be a better version of myself, right? Accountability to me is this idea that we are not done, right? We are not done. We have so much work to do. And so to really truly be in conversation with folks and to hold our communities in high regard, we have to be accountable to those folks that we say that we are in community with. And so for me, I'm accountable to Black folk, but I am specifically accountable to, queer folk, trans folk, poor folk, undocumented folk. I'm accountable to those who are most vulnerable. I hold myself accountable to those for whom I also have to acknowledge my privilege, right? Like for whom my privilege is also an obstacle and a stumbling block for me, right? In my writing, right? Those are the communities that I find myself most accountable to, the ones for whom I have the greatest likelihood of co-opting and harming. And so for me, it's about accountability is dynamic, and it's not a constant thing. It's not something where I'm accountable to one static community at all times. It's up to me to recognize that my accountabilities will shift based on what I'm writing, where I am, what I'm doing, and how folks are reading me. There are times where folks read me in ways that do not necessarily align with how I see myself. But if it's Black folk, I'm like, listen, I'm offering grace because I'm accountable to you too, right? So for me, all of that comes into play when I think about accountability. I'm gonna stop rambling. Go ahead, Hurry.
No, I love that, and I especially love accountability is dynamic. And I mean, I think as queer people, at least for me, like I look at everything through a queer lens, and so everything starts to like stop being so clear cut when you really start living life that way. And so that's especially what accountability has been like for me. I don't know, I think it might have been Miriam Kaba who said it, but I know Tobias has posts about this a lot, but you can't hold people accountable who you're not in community with. And that's been like really, really important to my understanding in a lot of ways recently. And what that means is that like accountability is a conversation. And so that means it's two ways, at least in this definition that has come to mean so much in my work. And what I've really come to understand, especially in like writing the book and trying to be accountable in the same ways that you mentioned, Amber, is that you really have to have, you have to be able to trust the people you're accountable with, but they also have to be able to trust you. You can't just say that just because I care about this community that I'm accountable to them. That trust has to be worked on, it has to be built. And so there are a lot of stories that I couldn't include in the book, even though I thought I was being able to tell them honestly, but I'm not in conversation with these people anymore. And so, I mean, honesty is subjective also. And what does it mean to tell somebody else's story and present it as like this honest story without getting their perspective? And so it was really hard writing the book because there are a lot of like really tense moments with like me and my family. But that's where accountability like really showed up, was like working through those things with them. But that's only a process that could have worked with my family. And I want to be able to like build my family out to a larger community of Black folks. But again, I think it takes work. And so those skills that I learn with like you all and with my family and with like my close friends, I bring those to my other relationships with queer people in general and Black people in general. But the process of community building still has to happen in order for me to be accountable to them. And so that's just been like a huge realization that I've been still having over the last couple of years, as I've been trying to be more accountable and to actually have something to show for that accountability process in my work. And I don't know, I'm not always there yet, but it's definitely not as simple as I thought it was. And I think if we all could view accountability as community building process, we'd have better answers to this question as writers in general.
Can I add to that? Because that was so like thought-provoking, which is always what happens whenever I hear Hurry talk. So I think that's absolutely right. And I also think that accountability yes, it has to be about community building. But and if you're listening to that, I'm thinking about the ways that community can also not come from a model of scarcity, right? It can't come from being compelled. It can't come from kind of a opposite reaction toward isolation. Like it requires that folks see accountability as a part of the process, right? Like a part of the process of writing, a part of the process of researching, of producing, of doing the work, right? It's like, I think a lot of times accountability is the thing that people would rather avoid if they could. And then if they get held accountable, they're like, oh, okay, like we about to, let's see what happens, right? It's like, but no, like, I think that to your point, Harid, that accountability, I almost sometimes wish that we had another word. I wish we had more words, but I think that it's become such a trigger word for people because folks associate it with cancellation, and rather it should be seen as an opportunity, right? It should be seen as a place to grow and a place to kind of move beyond scarcity models, ideas that say that there can only be one of us, or we have to knight ourselves as the speaker on this, thing. And I'm not gonna call no names or say the exact thing because I don't want to get in trouble. But I'm just saying, like, sometimes folks are not held accountable because they don't want to understand that our work, our liberation, it's expansive. We are all able to do this work. We are all able to find ways and modes of being within Blackness. We are all able to challenge ourselves, and we don't have to have the one, person. We don't have to have the one model. We don't have to have the one best way. And I think that's something we are really struggling with right now, because when it comes from whiteness always wants there to be one. Whiteness wants there to be one Black person, one Black savior, one Black man, one person that they can say is a token, one person that they can kind of say, this is the one who is a model, a benchmark. And when we start to embody that, then we start to shirk accountability to our own folks because of the potential rewards in proximity to whiteness, So, yeah, accountability has to be something that we see as embedded in the work. Otherwise, we are essentially serving folks who are not invested in Blackness and Black radicality.
I'm feeling all of that. And yeah, accountability it's a love practice. It doesn't mean it's a like practice. You don't like everybody you want to hold accountable, or sometimes you don't like yourself when you're trying to hold yourself accountable. But when we, like y'all were saying, like choose into accountability from a space of like collective participation and collective investment, then we move away from the individual and the scarcity mentality into a more abundant world that allows for all of us to be free and alive. But when we choose the latter, or when we choose the one before, it's just incredibly limiting, and it only serves a certain amount of folks, a certain type of person or people. Okay, y'all speaking tonight. Let's go into another question. I'm gonna switch these up a little bit. Let's talk about, as we've talked a bit about accountability. So now let's talk about how you check in with yourself and stay true to the audience that you have committed to.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's definitely super related, right? But I think there's a really great recent example for our work at Race Trader that I won't get into so much because I think there's a lot to say. But one of the things that we had to hold ourselves accountable for was we published the work of Jessica Krug, who was a white woman who was pretending to be Black. And there's a large backstory to that. But obviously, this is money that should have gone to actual Black women and platforms and a perspective that's being shared that's a violent and white supremacist perspective. And so one of the things that we had to think through, and I think we're still thinking through, Amber, is how do we hold ourselves accountable to that? And so for me as the EIC, my first thing was to check in with you all. And so I've worked at a lot of companies where like people at the top just make decisions, or they figure out how to respond to something, and that almost never works. And there's always some oversight. And even like my first ideas of like what we should do, like you pointed out a lot of really interesting things that I wouldn't have thought about. And so I think it's really important to have a community there. This doesn't work. Even though you're talking about self-work, like how do you check yourself? I can only do that because I have like people like you that I can trust. And so I think another thing that I've definitely been learning over the past couple of years is that all of the self-work that I am trying to do is work that is done best in community. There is no me without y'all. There is no me without my family. And I think it's very like a white supremacist mode of thinking that like you can individually progress without a community that you're progressing with. And so, yeah, for me, it's having people there who I know, like I can trust their perspective. If I fucked up with something, like I can run it by y'all, and I know that you're gonna tell me, and you're not gonna hold back. And I know that whatever you say is gonna come out of love, and that's because I've worked on these relationships over time. But also knowing that, but the step before that is knowing that you will fuck up, and that you've learned a lot of this shit from. Sorry, I'm cussing so much, but from being in this media world that's like such a, like we said, a white supremacist. It's been set up in this way for such a long time, and even though we're unlearning it, and I think I do give myself credit for unlearning a lot of it. There's always going to be work to do, and so always being open to that, always being open to being called to account. Us being open to apologizing when you have made a mistake, and trying to do better the next time. Knowing that you can always love Black people better is really, really important to that every day. That's like something I try to remember is how do I love people better today than I did yesterday? So yeah.
Yes, that's what's up. So yes. With this question, I keep thinking about this year. I've been really working on radical truth telling, and people are like, "Were you lying before?" I'm like, "No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I'm trying to be truthful with myself in ways that I wasn't before." And my nesting partner suggested that I refer to it as absolute candor, and it's one of those things where I think, in terms of doing self work and challenging ourselves. We have to understand that there's truth, absolutely the truth that we share with others, and there's the self that we present to the world. But there's also the ways we have to face ourselves. And self work is the hardest work, but it's the most fruitful work, right? It's the best work. And I'm thinking about the context right now, like quarantine and COVID-19, and the fact that so many of us are, living in situations that we've never experienced before. Many of us are isolated, not seeing family members, not seeing friends, and we are faced with ourselves in new and different ways. And at least for me, in thinking about the self-work that's needed for us to continue to remain accountable to the communities that we are, that we care about, that we come from, whose stories we are lucky enough to be able to tell at the publications where we find ourselves telling them. For me, it has been about the truth telling with myself, right? What are the ways that I also embody anti-Blackness? What are the ways that I also participate in misogynoir? What are the ways that I also get on some elite classes bullshit? Like, what are the ways that I myself, as I'm writing these things, as I'm writing books or articles, and I'm thinking through these things publicly on Twitter, what are the ways that I myself am embodying, right? These very same issues. And that's not always comfortable, right? It's not always comfortable. And we don't always want to share that with other people, right? We don't always want to be like, oh my gosh, like I did this thing yesterday and I'm so ashamed about it, right? But the truth is that until we start to really be honest with ourselves about how we move through the world, right? Our situatedness, our position, our own privilege, the complexity of our power, right? Our agency, how we leverage our agency, in which situations we choose to speak up and which ones we don't, right? What things we tend to share, what things we tend not to share, right? And I think that that's when we start to really see how we ourselves sometimes avoid accountability, right? We sometimes don't want to have that conversation, but it's such an important conversation. And so I think the long answer is like, it's the truth telling, yes, the public truth telling, but it's also the personal and the private truth telling, right? It's the desire and the commitment. Because someone said this to me a couple months ago, I said, "Oh, I love Black people." And they were like, "You're Black, right? You got to love yourself just as hard." And I was like, "Oh," like it hit me so hard. I was like, "Oh no." And I think that's part of it too. Like we have to tell ourselves the truth, right? When we say we love Black people and we do this work because we want to tell true stories in honor and regard for our ancestors and our elders and our communities, that includes us too. And that's something I've been working on is like, how do I fit in that story? And how do I do justice to myself, right? And that's been something I've really been struggling with this year because I'm realizing there are a lot of ways that we are trained not to do justice to ourselves. And that I think is one of the greatest hurdles to the self-work that we have to do.
I love that you said that. I just wanted to quickly, before we move into the next, you also point out shame being a really big part of that. And that's why I think it's really important that we're having these conversations about abolition right now. That's why this is so timely. Because I think everything ties back to abolition. But that component of shame is such a huge hurdle to progress, because instead of being able to make a mistake and learn from it, move on from it, grow from it, we run from it because we're taught that like mistakes are punished. If you do something wrong, you're a bad person. And like these ideas don't really mesh with healing and growth. And so I'm really glad you brought up shame, because I think a big part of this is fighting against shame and carceral logics and punitive logics. And so instead of punishing people for the things that they're doing, trying to create a society where we can all heal from it is really critical to this work.
Yes, to all of that. Thank y'all for sharing. Also want to note that y'all can curse here. Like this is like we are all in our homes, or our families' homes right now. And so like all of this shit about like being professional on Zoom is a lie. Audience members,
right.
a lie. Okay. So if you wanna curse, if you wear short shorts, whatever, we are, it's an honor to be in each other's homes in this way. And so we don't have to like police our language here.
Thank you for that. I'm so used to being around my little nephews and nieces, and so.
I'm gonna do better.
You're so right. You're right.
I'm gonna do better.
Whatever y'all want to do, but I'm just saying, I'm gonna just say you can do whatever you want to do here. I love that. I love all of the things y'all brought up. Folks who are submitting questions, please continue to. We'll get to them in a few minutes. I also want to highlight something that Hari said about, this kind of responsibility for platforms to really think about the ways that folks have been harmed by whiteness, and folks have been harmed by lies, and some people have been rewarded for it, including, she who will not be named by me, and how a lot of platforms, they just pulled her stuff from their sites, but she got paid for it, right? And she also got grants, and she also got all of these different things. And so one of the reasons I appreciate the way Race Baiter has approached it is they were like, okay, this is how many, or we were like, this is how many articles she wrote. We're going to triple that and have it continue, and then give those to actual Black women. So that's an opportunity for media platforms to really think about and re-engage and recommit to Black liberation. And it's a very tiny part, but that's something that can be done always and should be done.
Mm-hmm. So I love that, and I've watched how folks have responded. I don't want to drag nobody. So but I think that the way that Race Baiter has handled She Who Will Not Be Named, is a particularly important example of the ways that organizations, institutions can hold themselves accountable to the folks that they say that they serve. And how when you look at that model versus others, it's really a stark difference. And I say this as someone who has been watching and who has intentionally not engaged in any conversations around this person, right? But I'm using this person as an example now, right? So thinking about the ways, for instance, any person will do harm to Black folks, and specifically Black women, right? And how that often becomes a point of newsworthiness, or it's like, oh, we've all got this important panel now to talk about this person. And I've been noticing all of these panels of people who don't actually know that person, people who are like commentators, and for me, rather than an accountability process or a restorative justice process, because honestly, this is harmful to so many of us, but it's also kind of reopening the wound every time another one of these panels goes up, that we have to be reminded that people continue to do this to our communities, right? But I've seen a lot of folks who have seen it as an opportunity to, kind of do the whole like, I know these different terminologies, let me teach you what misogynoir is, da, da, da. And I'm like, that's great. Like, that's a great starting point, I guess, right? But what I'm really interested in wondering more about is like, how do we start to think about these institutions and these organizations that are Black serving? And how do we start to ask them to actually understand what an accountability process looks like, rather than one that is performative, one that is like, oh, some people who would pull down articles. A lot of them didn't issue statements. A lot of them didn't acknowledge the ongoing relationships that they've had with that person and other folks who've done similar things, right? But then they continue to publish stories about it, and they continue to hype it. They continue to have panels. They continue, and it's like, well, you can take the articles down, but if you are still benefiting from this form of exploitation that is continuing to harm us, right? How is that? I don't understand. I guess for me, I don't quite understand it. So I'm kind of like, let's all decide that we don't fuck with this person no more, right? And let's just be done, right? Like, for me, that's the answer. But that's not how things have gone. Even up until like last week, I'm still seeing like panels and panels and panels of people who, see this as a social opportunity. And I struggle with that. I'm going to be honest, I struggle with it. And I don't know exactly what an accountability model looks like in that respect. And I don't know, maybe y'all have some ideas. I'm not sure.
Well, I think
question. Oh, Hari, before you actually answer that, I'm going to take this question because it'll probably tie in to what y'all are gonna share. So one of the questions by an anonymous attendee is, how do you hold those in charge accountable when there are gatekeepers to building community with them, like within the hierarchy of academia, for instance?
Yeah, so I think it is a great, it was just what I was gonna say, because I think, Jen, you putting it in terms of like socially profiting off of this, and like the capitalist system itself kind of reinforces these things happening, because there's always something to be made out of this. And even like, I don't know, it's just, you can always find, even if you're like holding accountable or making a statement, there's always a way to do it that you can benefit from it, but that also reinforces the problem. And so I think as media makers, you have to, I think Amber, you pointed out too, like we were gonna name the recipients of the grant. And that was like one of those things that I wasn't thinking through, but it probably would have like made us look like, within this like framework, we're trotting these people out and like, well, this is what we did for them, blah, blah. And we would have gotten some benefit from that. And so without questioning those systems and like what benefits happen, like when you do things a certain way, you fall into that all the time, I think. And so you always have to question what you're benefiting from, what the model is, who's making money from this. Like we've also like tried to reject, like we only make money at Race Beta from our subscribers and donors. And a part of that is because I didn't want to be at the behest of anyone who's doing ads and things. And I mean, that's not feasible to everyone, but I think challenging what economic models look like and what social capital looks like at every step is really important. And acknowledging that there is social capital in everything is capitalized in a capitalist system is super important.
Mm-hmm. So I feel bad because I asked the question. I really, truly do not have an answer. Like I don't have an answer, especially when we start talking about gatekeepers. It gets back into the question of how we ourselves embody the very principles that we see ourselves seeking to dismantle, and our own complicity in white supremacist, acts and behaviors, which happens all the time. And I think that so gatekeeping again is it stems from a scarcity model. It's the idea that I have to stand at the gate because if anyone else gets in or if too many people get in, we won't have enough room, right? There's not enough space for all of us. And the truth is that there is, right? And so I think the answer to part of the question, right? Part of the question, which is about how do we hold those in charge accountable, right? It does still go back to the truth telling, right? It does still go back to, we don't have to protect folks who are not doing the work of Black liberation. Like we do not have to bear the burden of holding on to folks' secrets, right? I always think about what's been going on with Ebony for all these years, right? And how a lot of that, continued to happen because they were intimidating people and basically making it like, it was kind of like, we're Ebony, right? Like we are Ebony. And so because they had the namesake, folks were fearful of telling the truth about their experiences, right? Folks were worried about their potential ability to continue telling stories because of what might happen to them, right? And I think that I feel bad because I feel like all of our answers are the same, right? Is community, right? Part of the reason why folks who have been involved with the losses and the claims against Ebony has been because they came together and they told the truth. They came together and they told the truth. And I honestly think that if we are going to move forward in a way that situates these institutions, these publications, these organizations, the academy, right, as real tools or mechanisms for Black liberatory work, we will have to be honest about the ways that they continue to do harm, right? We cannot protect them from themselves. And if that means that the org ends up going away, we have to be okay with that, right? Like if that means that, we have institutions like Ebony, right, that have been around for so long, but over time, we're not serving us, right? We have to be honest about that. And if that means that we no longer have Ebony as an institution, then we have to say that we deserve something better, right? And truthfully, that's the only way that you can overcome the gatekeeping is by acknowledging that what's behind the gate is not serving you anyway, right? And that the gatekeeping is really just a performance, right? So I think the question is obviously ongoing. Like we have to keep talking about it. We have to keep figuring out what that is because it's going to require us to also be thinking about other forms of funding. To Harlee's point about thinking about other economic models, we have to think about ways to fund ourselves, right? And I'm really excited about, like, there's a lot of new granting agencies that are opening up all over the country, looking for equity in grant making for artists and writers, which is fantastic, right? There's a lot of folks who are actively working to make media more proportionately representative of the folks that read it and that purchase it and that participate in it. But I don't think that that's like, I don't think that there's a easy answer. I just think that we have to continue to hold these truths front and center, and we cannot allow the temporary privilege or the temporary payoff of that byline or that, whatever, be the thing that keeps us from seeing the bigger picture, which is that if it's not serving us, if it's not doing justice to us, then we shouldn't be participating in it.
Yeah, I think too, like all of these systems require we're exhausted all the time, right? Like on one hand, we have to produce, we have to produce all of this content and all of these things, and on the other hand, we don't have time for passion. We don't have time for joy and pleasure. And so I think it's also really important to revisit the ways our folks have always played. Like, I'm so tired of like slave narratives that don't also include the ways our folks lived, not just, which is real, of course, enslaved folks experience hell. But it's not the only thing that they experienced, and questioning our audience constantly. And I think there's always also an opportunity for accessibility, not just an opportunity for, but we need to prioritize accessibility in our events as well, this one included, where folks are actually able to engage more with the content, with the conversation, and also be able to access conversations that typically are not provided or offered. Robbie asked the question that I think is really helpful. What are the ways that you balance listening to yourself / doing what you need for yourself as part of self-work and a level of effectiveness in your work? Like, what tools do you use, and how is your family or community a part of that?
That's a lot of questions. You want me to go? Okay, I'm gonna start. So this is a really important question. So balance, the word balance gives me so much visceral anxiety. Like whenever I hear balance, I think when people say work-life balance, I have never been in balance. I am always out of balance. Like, I don't know a time when I've ever been in balance. And I think for me, as someone who also has anxiety and depression, I medicate for anxiety and depression. I also have physical disabilities that two of my children also have. And the ways that my body and I are often in negotiation with one another, right? So for me, the listening part of that question is what really has been a lesson for me as I've gotten older, right? Listening to myself, doing what I need for myself before it becomes an emergency, right? To your point earlier, Amber, these systems push us to limits such that we make new limits every time we're pushed, right? It's like, oh, I didn't know I could do that. Okay, I'm gonna push myself harder next time. Oh, I didn't know I could do that. That is not healthy, right? And we derive so much meaning and worth from what we can provide to people and to these organizations, but not in how it makes us feel. And so last year I picked up Adrienne Brown's Pleasure Activism, and I read the first chapter and I was like, oh, I feel so seen, right? Because I realized I was doing so many things that did not make me feel good. They didn't make me feel good. And then when I asked myself why I was doing them, I didn't have a really good answer. So I think I don't know that I've been able to balance listening to myself and doing what I need for myself with effectiveness. But what I do know is that I don't use effectiveness as the primary model or lens through which I understand how I live my life every day, right? I no longer do that. Effectiveness for me is no longer tethered to tasks and to-do lists and check boxes and Google calendar reminders, right? Now it's about, how do I feel at the end of the day? Am I pleased with myself? Am I proud of myself? Is my community proud of me? Did I meet my agreements, right? These are the things that regulate how I make those decisions. And so in terms of like tools, a whole lot of therapy, a whole lot of therapy, which has been amazing for me and really helpful for me to be doing the work of being honest with myself and listening to myself. Um, and also journaling has been like phenomenal. Writing down what's going on with me, keeping track of what's going on, and feeling the feelings, allowing myself to feel, not seeing my feelings as something that need to be hidden or boxed in or put away, but as valid, as someone who is feminine presenting, feminine centered, and who has been socialized as a woman, right? I was told that my emotions were dangerous and that they were out of control and that they were a risk. And so for me, a lot of it has been allowing myself to believe that my emotions matter and they regulate everything that I choose to do, whether it be professional or personal.
Yes, I love all of that. And just for the sake of time, but also it makes sense. I see another question is also asking about the healing practices that are facilitated by my book. I think it ties right into this. When I was writing Black Boy Out of Time, what I realized is that the work could be healing. Like the work, it doesn't have to be separate, which I think is to your point, Jen. Like, or at least, and especially like the concept of effectiveness in work doesn't have to be separate. Like my book became much more effective when it became a book about my therapy process. I also, like you, I have 3 different therapists right now. But and also like my spiritual practice is explored in this book. And what happened as I started to incorporate that in the book, it started to show up in all of my work. And the reason for that is because my work started to be less about what I thought was effectiveness and more a process of like asking questions that I needed answered. And in the book in particular, I do a lot of inner child work that I was doing in therapy. I was like, oh, I can just do this in the book. And so there's a lot of chapters that are written to my younger self. And I'm working through the things that I needed to work through with my younger self in the book, like actually writing to my younger self. And in doing that, I'm like learning new things about myself and providing for the inner child the kinds of comfort and the kind of answers and the kind of things that I needed. And that's what work can do. Like, I think when I started writing, I thought I needed to like answer all these questions and tell people what to do and blah, blah, blah. And in some ways, like I do hope that my work offers guidelines for other people, but really what it's doing is asking questions in order to make the next step in my own journey towards healing. And I'm inviting other people along on that journey. And hopefully it helps them as well, but ultimately it is for me. And I'm not ashamed to say that anymore. Like all of my work is for me. I've had a lot of conversations with like my PR people. Like, you still have to think about other people. I'm like, I am thinking about them. That doesn't mean it doesn't have to be about me and my healing, because I can't do anything for anyone else if I'm not healed. And so that's what the book is about, and that's what I found it through all of my work can be. And it's still hard. It's probably harder than it's ever been to do that kind of work, but it's also more fulfilling and it brings me more joy, and I feel much freer afterwards than any of the other type of work that might have been easier, quote unquote, but wasn't bringing me any healing. And so I would just, any advice to other writers would be to try and bring healing yourself to all of your writing, and seeing how that goes, and incorporating the questions that you have, not trying to always answer everything, and because that has worked for me at least.
Great, y'all. Thank you so much. There is one more question that I'm hoping we can just bring in real quick, and then we'll be done. Thank y'all for joining us. So Pri said, thank you so much for doing these panels. They can't believe that this is free. Do you all have any suggestions or direction for those Black folks who come from abusive backgrounds, making it hard to have community among blood-related family? And also, do you have any tips on building community through different online spaces?
Well,
Large question.
yeah. So, I mean, well, okay. So, I think I'm thinking about what I know of a lot of Black folks who I am in community with, and a lot of us have experienced trauma, whether it be kind of, emotional, physical, economic, or just having to deal with whiteness, right? And so I think that when we think about being in community, this is something I absolutely struggle with, at least in my 20s, all throughout my 20s, having dealt with like multiple sexual assaults in my teenage years, and coming into my 20s and not trusting anyone, and not feeling safe anywhere. And I'm obviously not a medical professional, so I can't give advice, but what I can say is that, going back to Harry's point earlier about healing, a lot of what I have been able to cultivate in terms of community today has been because I was able to start to allow myself vulnerability, and start to find small places, quiet places, where I could land softly, whether it be a gentle friend who I had met, or whether it be a therapist, whether it be a community organization. But I did not force myself to do work that I wasn't ready to do. I didn't allow superficial timelines about, oh, by this time you should be at this point in your life, or you should have this understanding of your sexuality, or this understanding of your, I didn't let those things govern how I moved, even though there were times where I felt immense pressure to conform to that. I felt immense pressure to be effective, and to be responsive to these societal demands on how I healed. And so I gave myself a lot of time, and I forgave myself for the times when I felt like I wasn't doing enough. And I allowed myself, and still do, to make mistakes. And so for me, a lot of where I'm at now, and the healing that I've gotten to now, has been a result of being really gentle and careful with myself, and really caring for myself and my heart, and checking in with myself. So it, to me, links to the earlier question about balancing and listening to yourself, and how you know what you need to do and what tools you have. Because coming from the history that I've come from, that made it harder, right, to listen to myself. It made it harder to see my wins as wins. It made it harder for everything to feel like I was worth anything or deserved anything. And so I still struggle with those things, right? And so I've grown to be okay with not being perfect, and with making mistakes, and with not knowing the answers, but just trying really hard to love myself genuinely, and in ways that feel fruitful for me, and that feel that serve me, as opposed to what society has told me I should be doing.
Yes, and that's so important too, within the context of like what a blood family should look like. I think one of the hardest things about having trauma in your family is like, that this is not what family is supposed to look like, and there's a lot of shame, at least for me there was, of like, my family's not what I wanted it to be, and I carried that with me when it's not mine to carry, because no family is perfect. And so I think giving yourself the space to not have to have the same story of like somebody who, has this loving blood family, is really important. And to your point about online spaces and healing, to Jen's point about healing, I think there the online spaces around healing that I've found that could be really helpful for someone who's looking for online community are around like African traditional religions in particular. And I would really encourage you to find those spaces. I know, Priest, I'll reach out to you with more suggestions as well. But these spaces are dedicated to not just being Black folks, but also spiritual healing. And so that's like central to the community. I think it's also really important to find communities around different interests. But as you're going through like healing from trauma, spirituality, at least for me, was really central to that, and rediscovering that it didn't have to be a type of spirituality that I grew up with. So yeah, I'll definitely reach out to the person who asked this question as well with more specific suggestions.
Thank you all for asking all those amazing questions. We're really grateful for you being here. I'm going to pass it off to Kristen.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for doing the moderating work, Amber. And I just want to say how much we appreciate all three of you being here. I know all of us are having Zoom fatigue and just fatigue in general with the world. And I really appreciate you coming to have this conversation and hope that we can support other work that you want to do in the future. So thank you. And thank you again to our co-sponsor, the Reproduction of Race and Racial Ideologies Workshop. So thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Bye.